Welcome to another edition of The Plane Guys. I'm Jeffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Germany. Good afternoon, Richard.
Good afternoon, Jeffrey. It's
Yeah,
good morning for me.
yes, it is indeed. So today we'll be examining the tragic crash of a Turkish Airlines DC-10 on 3 March 1974, just north of Paris. Now, I've studied this accident in depth over many years, so Richard's going to put me through my paces and quiz me on it. But before we dive into the details, I want to acknowledge that this was a devastating tragedy with multiple contributing factors that would take hours to fully explore. Our aim today is to highlight and summarise some of the key points, many of which have been overlooked by the tabloid press.
Yeah, the tabloid press again,
Mm,
not doing their homework. But
no.
you really have done your homework on this one. Can we start, as usual, with an overview, please?
Yes, certainly, Richard. So Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was scheduled service from Istanbul to London Heathrow with a stop at Orly Paris Airport. That was in the days before the Charles de Gaulle Airport was built. On the 3rd of March 1974, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 Series 10, operating the flight, crashed into the Ermeville forest, approximately 38 kilometres, 24 miles, northeast of Paris, killing all 335 passengers and 11 crew on board. The aircraft originally carried 167 passengers and 11 crew on its first leg to Paris, and 50 of those passengers disembarked in Paris. They were Paris bound. Normally, the Paris-London leg was underbooked, but due to a strike by British European Airways baggage handlers, many stranded passengers were rebooked onto Flight 981, delaying its departure by 30 minutes. Thus, the flight was full. The crash occurred when the rear cargo door, improperly secured, blew off at altitude, causing an explosive decompression. This severed or jammed essential flight and rear engine control cables. With the elevator control severed and engine cable to the rear engine jammed, the aircraft entered a 20-degree dive and ultimately crashed into the forest, killing everybody on board.
Yeah, well, that really is tragic, especially
Mm.
for those who joined the flight because of a strike.
Yeah.
Um, so why did the door fail at the rear of the aircraft?
Yeah. So most wide-bodied aircraft have outward facing or outward opening, I should say, cargo doors, which makes them vulnerable to failure due to the presence of a differential at altitude. It's a pressure differential. To counter this, a special latching system is used that locks the door securely when properly engaged. However, a similar incident had occurred earlier on American Airlines Flight 96 in 1972, where it was discovered that the rear cargo door could be forced shut by ground crew even if the internal locking mechanisms had not properly engaged. There had also been a ground testing incident in 1970, although that involved a different and larger cargo door on the other side of the aircraft. Both the American and Turkish incidents involved the smaller rear cargo door located near the tail of the aircraft. Now, following Flight 96 incident, two critical design changes were mandated in a service bulletin. A stronger support plate for the handle linkage to prevent the door from being forced shut if not properly latched, and a viewing window to visually confirm that the locking pins were engaged. So the latches be would be electrically moved over locking mechanism, and then locking pins would then engage and making sure that they could not then move. Whilst the viewing window was installed on the Turkish DC-10, the reinforced support plate was not. Some say that change should have been made in a more urgent airworthiness directive, but this would not have changed a thing, as this DC-10 was out of the loop, so to speak, when the changes were required.
So, why not, Jeff?
So, Richard, it's quite a story. The Turkish DC-10 was originally one of six destined for All Nippon Airways. However, the deal was cancelled after after the Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka and other top officials had accepted a total of $9 million in bribes from Lockheed to have the All Nippon order transferred to the Lockheed TriStar instead. So McDonnell Douglas subsequently sold three of those aircraft to Turkish Airlines and three to Laker Airways. Tanaka reportedly received of that 9 million, 6 million. The particular aircraft involved was Ship 29, and we're showing you an image of it now, and you'll see it is not in any airline colour scheme. That's because it came off the production line, unsold at that particular moment, and sat idle at McDonnell Douglas plant for several months, caught in limbo between cancelled production and a new buyer. During this period, both required modifications were signed off as completed, but in reality, only the viewing window was installed. There was clearly confusion at the factory.
Yeah, and $6 million in bribe going to Tanaka and another 3 million somewhere else.
Mm.
So, how did all that play out on the day of the crash?
Well, here is where it gets seriously complex. Turkish Airlines had reportedly been having issues with this cargo door, and the cockpit warning light was disabled. So it falsely indicated that the door was closed even when it was open. The regular Turkish ground engineer in Paris was on leave, and he would typically verify the door's closure because they knew they had this problem. The task fell, perhaps, to the flight engineer, although it's unclear if it was properly checked before he got back on board the aircraft and for the takeoff to Heathrow. The baggage handler who closed the door was fluent in Arabic and French, but the instructions were only in English and Turkish. He later testified that he was never trained to properly close the door or check the viewing window. The aircraft took off at 13,000 feet, the cargo door blew off. According to Captain Bryce McCormick, who commanded the American Airlines Flight 96 and faced a similar failure, the damage to the Turkish aircraft was less severe than what he had experienced. McCormick managed to regain control of his DC-10 by applying power to the remaining two engines, so the two wing engines. The nose came back up and he was in control and able to land his DC-10 safely despite the extensive damage. And he said it was just that simple. The Turkish crew also applied power to the two other engines, the two wing engines, there's one in the tail, but it was too late. The aircraft impacted the forest in a nearly level altitude and cut a swathe through the forest almost a kilometre long. Absolute scene of devastation. So it would appear that if they'd applied power earlier to their other two engines, they would have regained control of the aircraft and saved it.
So, in one case, 346 fatalities, and in the other case, no fatalities at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you've actually visited the crash site, haven't you?
Yes, Richard. I was attending the Paris Air Show with my wife Christine and her son Simon, and we found the wreckage site, and the wreckage, a lot of wreckage is still there, scattered across the forest. And it was interesting. We walked into the forest and I knew there was some debris and I found a little piece and I put it into my bag. And as we walked further, I said to Christine, people have been camping here. Look at those campsites. But on closer inspection, it was burnt wreckage and it was chilling. There was tray tables, shoes, wiring, even parts of the wing. And I reached into my bag and took out this little piece of debris and put it back on the ground. And that debris is still visible to this day, although the undergrowth has really, the last time I visited, about 5, 6 years ago now, the undergrowth has really developed and it's very difficult to find it, but it is still there. It's almost as though the forest has claimed this terrible crash site. I mean, this part of the forest was actually replanted. And when you go to Google Earth, you can actually see this strip of different type of foliage, which is where this crash site is. It's a scar on Google Earth.
Wow. Now, you believe McDonnell Douglas was unfairly treated in the aftermath. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, look, absolutely. Captain McCormick, in a letter to Aviation Week, which we're showing you now, following the final French report in 1976, raised several critical points. He was quite critical of the French report. He said the report stated that adjustments were made to the cargo door after delivery. By whom remains unclear. One such modification, in fact, rendered the missing reinforcement plate ineffective even if it had been installed. He also questioned who disabled the cockpit rear cargo door warning light. It just didn't work. And he said these are serious oversights that weren't adequately addressed in the final conclusions of the French report. Essentially, he was saying the damage to my plane was worse. And with all of these misadjustments or maladjustments or modifications, whatever faults there were out of McDonnell Douglas, which was not installing this support plate, they were rendered useless and totally ineffective. So, he really does question the report, and he questioned Turkish Airlines' role or their maintenance provider, their role in this terrible tragedy.
So the DC-10 had a rough public image. Was it justified?
Well, yes, Richard, to some extent, yes, it was. There were several other high-profile accidents. Chicago, 1979, which was in fact American Airlines' fault for faulty maintenance. Sioux City, United Airlines in 1989, which was the failure of the GE, General Electric, front fan disc on the rear engine. But overall, the DC-10 was statistically safer than many of its contemporaries. And that's something that's completely lost. So, according to Boeing's 2020 statistical summary of commercial jet crashes per million departures, the following applied at the time. The DC-10 had 1.28 fatal crashes per million departures. The Boeing 747-100, 200, 300 series had a fatal crash rate of 1.46, so the 747 was worse. The Airbus A310 had a crash failure rate of 1.89. The Fokker F-28 twin-jet, great aeroplane, 2.3 fatal crashes per million departures. The Douglas DC-8, 4 fatal crashes per 1 million departures. And the Boeing 707 and similar out-of-service jets like the VC-10, Convair 880, Convair 990, 4.41 fatal crashes per 1 million departures. I mean, those numbers compared to today's aircraft like the 787 and the A350 and A380 have zero. I mean, it's way safer today, but compared to this first and second generation of aircraft, the DC-10 wasn't nearly as bad as it's made out in the media.
No, in fact, it was the safest aircraft on the list that you've just gone through.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the safest, sure.
Now, some McDonnell Douglas executives were portrayed in the media as callous and greedy people. You've met some of them, haven't you?
Yes, I have, Richard, many times. And, and one of the things that struck me, without exception, they were deeply committed professionals who cared greatly about safety. They were really beautiful people. And I believe they were very unfairly vilified by the popular media. I mean, aircraft are designed using the very best technology of the time. But if they're not maintained or operated properly, particularly by under-trained staff or badly trained staff, can we solely blame the manufacturer? That said, the manufacturers do have responsibility to consider the operational capability of their customers and ensure sufficient training. It's a very sensitive but essential balance to make. It's quite difficult. But Richard, you've also met Bob Haig, have you not?
Yeah, I met Bob Hage back in 1968 in Colorado Springs. Bob Hage was the chief engineer on the Boeing 707, and in 1958 he moved to McDonnell Douglas, and a year later he was charged with the development of the DC-10 and oversaw that for 10, 11 years. The aircraft first flew in 1970 and first came into service with American Airlines in 1971. And I recall him saying they recalculated the cost of production of the DC-10 every day during the 10 years of its development. They knew exactly how many DC-10s they had to produce to break even. And there were 446 DC-10s produced finally, which includes 60 KC-10 refueling tankers. And they only needed to sell 224 to break even. So it was a commercial success. It outpaced the Lockheed L1011 TriStar, only sold 250 aircraft. Of course, the Boeing 747, which came into service in 1970, outpaced both of them. But the media saying callous and greedy, I know because I've actually read the autobiography of Bob Hage, When I Looked to the Heavens, that he was a man who was of Christian belief and spent a lot of money supporting missions around the world. And he was on the board of several missionary organizations. He was far from callous or greedy.
Indeed, I've met him, and he struck me, and I know I've also read his book, A Deeply Religious Man. And I met him at the final delivery of the last commercial jet to leave the McDonnell Douglas Works in Long Beach, California in 2006. And we're showing you a picture of a group of executives, Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, former McDonnell Douglas executives. And he is the gentleman on the extreme left, a really beautiful man. And when you meet these guys and you have the opportunity of meeting these guys, you think there's no way they were callous, greedy, that sort of person. Anything but.
Now, there have been some scathing books about the DC-10, and you've read them all. What's your opinion of these books?
Well, many of them were riddled with inaccuracies. One destination disaster claimed the DC-10 was rushed into production, and that's simply not true. I mean, you're talking about Bob. When he joined McDonnell Douglas, he was pressed into
Ten,
what.
10 years it took.
Exactly. So the design studies for the DC-10 go back, in fact, to 1960 with the US Air Force's large C-5A program. And Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed and Convair submitted proposals for this requirement. And after Lockheed won the C-5A contract in 1965, Boeing focused on the 747 and Douglas began working and refining the DC-10 as a passenger aircraft. And we're showing you at the moment one of the initial DC-10 designs, which is, as you can see, looks like a C-5A Galaxy. But they began working on that and finalised it in late 1967. So no, the DC-10 was not rushed anything but. It was, however, in a sales battle with Lockheed, with its almost identical TriStar, and there was a battle to secure the first orders and thus an edge. But that was up to the sales guys, not the designers, not the engineers. They just plodded along to get things right. Now, Flight International, the highly respected industry journal, in fact, ridiculed Destination Disaster, the book. In reality, it was Lockheed that was playing catch up, as it had stopped building commercial aircraft with the Electra in the early 1960s, whereas Boeing and Douglas had a continuous history of building commercial jets. Over the decades, the DC-10 became one of the most reliable of the early jumbo jets, and it was flown by leading airlines like Lufthansa, Swissair, KLM, SAS, Japan Airlines, Finnair, Singapore Airlines, and British Airways without any major incidents, none whatsoever. And after that, when those airlines had finished with the DC-10, many of them ended up with FedEx, and they converted many DC-10s to pure freighters. It was called the MD-10. And they saw service with FedEx and UPS right up till very, very recently. They've only been retired in the last 4 or 5 years. So had an incredibly long life because it was such a robust and top aircraft.
Jeffrey, fascinating insight into the aviation industry and this accident in particular. So, what's the bottom line, do you think?
Well, the bottom line, of course, if we don't learn the lessons from each aircraft accident and correctly implement the changes, disasters will happen again. And we've seen that many times. The Service Bulletin 5238 was not done correctly. The settings on the safety pins and the lock limit warning switch were incorrectly done by the airline or its maintenance provider. We just don't know. American Airlines Flight 96 was a near disaster that warned of a critical flaw. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was a preventable tragedy caused by ignored warnings, inadequate fixes, lax training, and an oversight at Paris Orly as far as the ground handling of the aircraft was concerned. The Paris crash led to major redesigns of the DC-10 and changes in the international aviation safety regulation and enforcement. So a lot was learnt from this terrible tragedy, lots of changes made, and aviation benefited, sadly, benefited from this terrible tragedy.
Yeah, well, thank goodness. And the safety record just, proves the point, doesn't it?
It does. Particularly you look at it today, it's amazing. So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you, viewers, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed our look at this terrible Turkish Airlines DC-10 accident. Thank you very much, Richard, for your input to this episode. And tomorrow we'll be back with more of your questions on MH370, will we not?
Indeed, and we will look forward to receiving your questions and comments.
We will indeed. So thanks for subscribing. And if you are not subscribing, please do. And we'll look forward to talking with you tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye for now.